super interesting. And I think that you'll enjoy it. So without further ado, Heather.
Thanks. I always love your introductions are always different, so I never really know quite what I'm getting when you introduce me. So I kind of hold my breath a little bit, but that was a wonderful one. So thank you all for having me. It is Thursday, not Friday, so you have one more day of standard work before you get to go and celebrate your weekend. Although, from what I understand about the real estate business, most of you work on the weekends too. So I don't know, maybe that's less of a necessary evil. But today we're talking about anxiety. We have talked about this topic before. So if you have heard parts of this presentation, Jewel and I figured out it was the first presentation that we did hybrid when we came back after COVID. So I feel like we're almost at the 2-year mark, Chad, for our anniversary. But I realized that this is one of the most common things that my clients and our community deals with. So I figured it would be a good idea to do a little refresher. So I don't always do a disclaimer with you guys, but I thought today might be a good opportunity for us to just give you a reminder of the fact that Monthly Mindset is really designed to be a source of information for you. It's topics that I find enjoyable, that I enjoy teaching other people about, but it's also an opportunity for you to do some self-reflection. And maybe this topic will inspire you to take a little bit of a look deeper internally to see if maybe this is something I deal with. But in the same breath, some of the topics that we discuss can impact you and can even at times cause distress. And so you guys know that I'm a licensed therapist in the state of Hawaii, so I'm available to you if you need additional support. But there are lots of resources out there if this does trigger something for you and you decide like, maybe this is, something I want to talk more about with a professional. So again, a source of information, maybe a little inspiration for you for self-reflection, but it can be heavy topics. So just so you know, there's always opportunity for you to reach out if you need something else. Starting with a cartoon, one of my favorites. Look, anxiety is one of those things that I feel like simultaneously is understood and misunderstood. Just because we have a feeling of anxiousness does not mean that we have an anxiety disorder. Anxiety disorders are categorized with very specific information and very specific symptoms. And we'll talk a little bit about that further on in the presentation. But I wanted to give you a little distinction between anxiety and stress. So anxiety is defined as feelings of fear, restlessness, tension, and worry. And when we feel anxious, we can have short periods of time in which we feel anxious or feel anxiety. And the cartoon is funny because clearly this poor young man in the red striped shirt is dealing with some anxiety because literally all I would do is think. But the girl that's asking the question, is probably innocently saying like, do you ever think about how rainbows get into the sky? Like, how do the colors happen? And is there really a pot? And the poor guy is like, yes, that's all I ever do is think. That's all I ever do is think. So anxiety really is this sort of persistent feeling of this fear and restlessness. A lot of times anxiety and other diagnoses like ADHD or inability to focus, things like that will co-occur. But anxiety really is in this idea that you can't quite sit still. Either your body is always tense, your brain is always worrying, your kind of soul feels fearful, you can't really focus on stuff. So that's kind of what anxiety looks like. Stress, on the other hand, is a super typical and like very common thing that I would argue 100% of the population deals with at some point in their life. And so stress is usually a response to some sort of change. When your responsibilities at work are very clear and you have your tasks all laid out, and then somebody comes to you and says, oh my God, we have to do this thing right now. It has to happen right now. That will incite a little stress response from you. Maybe you might sweat a little, maybe you might get distracted from what you were doing. Maybe you might go, oh my God, how am I going to fit this in? And the interesting thing that we don't talk about with stress is that even when the change that happens is positive or beneficial to us, like let's say you close on your house, let's say you get into a new relationship, let's say you buy a new car, even if those things are positive, they can still incite these stress responses. And again, they come from all kinds of things. They come from our workplaces, they come from our relationships, they come from attending school or missing school. They come, within day-to-day events. And so I find it really interesting when I'm sort of doing my own work and I have responses that I feel like are irrational or unnecessary. Like, for example, I was driving home from the gym yesterday. Somebody pulled out in front of me, like very clearly impatient and wanted to cut me off. I don't know, maybe they didn't want to, but I had this immediate sort of like road rage response to it. Like, what the, it's raining. Like, what are you idiot? What are you doing? And my friend Wendy was in the car with me and she goes, I think you just probably made a mistake. Like, it's not that big a deal. But I went all the way to this stress response of like, how dare he pull out in front of me? And so I feel like when we talk about stress, we have to recognize that our kind of moods and reactions can change even in regular day-to-day events like driving to and from somewhere. Stress responses for our body are very natural and are super healthy in the ways that our body is prepared to manage them. So when you have a stress response, like getting upset that somebody interrupted your work because they're asking you to do something, your stress responses actually help you navigate change. The issue that happens when it's prolonged or it happens continuously over time is what leads to things like anxiety disorders, challenges with your mental health, or even kind of having a like physical manifestation. For those of you that have potentially handled prolonged stress, you understand that your heart can race, you can feel simultaneously really strong and really weak, you can sweat, sometimes you have difficulties with freeze or flight responses. So stress is totally normal, super typical, we all deal with it. It's the prolonged stress or the result of the stress that can create the problems for our physical and emotional health. So when we talk about the difference between anxiety and stress, I want you to understand that anxiety is a deep-rooted potential disorder. Stress is a response. So anxiety is often built up stress and prolonged stress. So stress usually leads to anxiety. There are several different types of anxiety disorders. You can, of course, have what we call generalized anxiety disorder. So this is when you feel anxious most days, you're having several worries for a period of 6 months or longer. I want to be very clear that this is persistent anxiety that gets in the way of your day-to-day for at least 6 months. When you feel anxious about one change in your life and it lasts a couple of weeks, that is not something that would categorize you or qualify you for generalized anxiety disorder. This is the most common diagnosis for adults who struggle with anxiety because it's considered the larger umbrella anxiety disorder. So the other ones that we're going to talk about sort of fall under the categorization of anxiety disorders. But the interesting thing is you can be diagnosed with an anxiety disorder and have a reconciliation from it 2, 3, 4, 5 months afterwards when you get treatment or you start to put things into place that help you manage the symptoms of your anxiety. Some of the more common subsets of anxiety are what we call social anxiety disorder. This is when your anxiety specifically comes from a persistent fear of social situations. It could be one-on-one, it could be huge gatherings, it could be your guys' big parties, it could be even just doing a one-on-one with your clients or each other. It can happen in everyday interactions, like having difficulty going to the grocery store, difficulty going to the DMV, difficulty going to the bank, things like that. Even just errands that we would consider sort of typical or regular. If you're feeling a persistent fear of those things and you have to really talk yourself into doing them, it would be beneficial for you to talk to someone about whether or not social anxiety is something that you deal with or you're trying to manage and get some really good skills and coping mechanisms to manage those fears. Another subset of anxiety disorder is phobias. Most of us have heard about things like fear of heights or fear of spiders. Specific phobias are an extreme and irrational fear of a particular object or situation. And not only an extreme fear of them, but we go to great lengths to avoid any of that. So we won't get in an elevator if we have an extreme fear of small spaces. We won't go to the doctor or the nurse if we have a fear of needles. So specific phobias are these very extreme, very technically speaking from a diagnosis perspective, irrational fear of a particular object or situation. So if you have something like arachnophobia, which is the fear of spiders, or you have a fear of heights, you would likely go to a mental health professional to discuss how you will engage in that activity, to usually do what's called desensitization. So small exposures to those fears so that you can have less of an extreme reaction to them. Another type of anxiety is what we call panic disorder. This one pretty easily gets confused with like kind of generalized anxiety, because the disorder is really characterized by somebody who experiences panic attacks. And a lot of times we think panic attacks are anxiety, but panic attacks are very different than anxiety. First of all, they're generally not prolonged. So they're usually an escalation of panic in which we experience things like hyperventilating, things like having this insane and irrational need to escape from something, not being able to calm our nervous system down, not being able to slow our heart, not being able to stop sweating. Often it comes with crying, things like that. But it's a short-lived attack as opposed to anxiety, which is a prolonged reaction. If you deal with any of these things that I've just described, or your gut is sending little notes to you, it would probably be helpful if you reach out to someone to talk about whether or not this is something that you're managing, and get some really good skills and tools to deal with the disruption in your day-to-day. Before we talk about the difference between the disorders of anxiety and panic, any thoughts or questions on anxiety in general about this? You can feel free to put them in the chat too. I try to pay attention to that. Okay, so the interesting thing about anxiety is that it's a very common feeling. Like a lot of us deal with feeling anxious about something. I used to get anxiety before Monthly Mindset. I don't really get it anymore because all of you have been so wonderful and welcoming to me that it's actually desensitized my anxiety. So now I just show up and we talk, and I feel like it goes well pretty often. So this would be something like you're giving a big speech in front of a bunch of people and you feel like you're unprepared. This could be like, I have to go to the doctor, but I don't love going to the doctor. So anxiety is generally in anticipation of something. A couple of years ago, we started talking a lot about the difference between depression and anxiety. Depression is living in the previous, anxiety is living in the future. So anxiety is one of those things that creates worry and fear about something potentially happening or something that's about to happen. Panic attacks are a really severe physical reaction to your anxiety. So let's say you have a doctor's appointment, you know that they're going to draw blood, you have a pretty extreme fear of needles. The panic attack could happen the day, 2 days, when you're in the parking garage of the doctor's office, because the anxiety has been so prolonged and it's gathered so much in your system that the only way for it to come out is to create this explosion. So often our anxiety about something will lead to a panic attack. One of the things a therapist will work on you with is, one, discovering the kind of subset or the crux of what's happening with your anxiety, but also doing really small experiments to see what your body can handle so that you can do more of those things over time and lessen the propensity for your panic attacks to happen. Anxiety almost always presents as something that kind of bubbles under the surface. So a constant worry about money, a constant worry about being out in public when you have a COVID fear, constant worry about what's going to happen if somebody finds out I did X. Where panic attacks, like literally can sometimes feel like they come out of nowhere. There's generally a buildup to them when that bubble under the surface, there isn't enough space for it, but they can feel at the time when they exacerbate that they just came out of nowhere. Like all I did was park my car in the parking garage and I don't know where this panic attack came from, but all of a sudden I was crying and I couldn't breathe and my heart was racing. So while anxiety can have some of those same physical symptoms, panic attacks are a super compressed and explosive experience of those symptoms at the same time. So you're often sweating, crying, bright red, and your heart is beating all at the same time. And so the interesting thing about anxiety is that the better that we manage it over time, the less it impacts us in our day-to-day. With panic attacks, we really have to find the source of them and treat the source, because what happens is our anxiety and all that bubbling under the surface ignites our fight or flight. And so we have to figure out how to identify the problem, which for those of you that have ever heard of cognitive behavioral therapy, that's generally what we use. Is we identify the problem and then we talk about it. We figure out what the source of that problem is, what things set it off, why we might potentially feel that way. And then we start to lessen the impact that those fears or anxieties cause you and what they do to you, so that eventually your anxiety can lessen, and over time you can feel much better. So again, anxiety is something that happens in anticipation of something, and panic is generally a result of underlying and kind of like too much air in the balloon anxiety where something has to pop. The thing about panic attacks is that they can feel very alienating. And so even though the last thing you want to do is tell someone that you've dealt with a panic attack, the sooner that you tell someone that, the sooner you can get help with managing them. Okay, so interestingly enough, almost 20% of the adult population has a diagnosed anxiety disorder. I found these facts as of 2020. So my assumption or my guess would be that it's likely this has gone up. What we've dealt with in the last couple of years with COVID really, I mean, I would bet some money on the fact that this number has probably gone up. Women are twice as likely to experience anxiety than men. Interestingly enough, men generally experience more depression than anxiety, but women are twice as likely to experience anxiety than men are. So if you're female and you've dealt with anxiety and you've dealt with anxiety in a relationship, there are probably some things that come to mind about why this is. Some examples are women bear the majority of the pressure in the home. And so often they have more stressors coming at them than men do in typical relationships. In addition, we tend to feel our emotions more deeply than stereotypical men do. So often, because we feel more emotions, those emotions have more opportunity to create some sort of after effect, whether it's feeling anxious, feeling panicky, having fear, things like that. One of the most impactful thing that you can do when you're dealing with anxiety is learn how to breathe. I know that all of you have heard this over and over and over and over again when we talk about things like mindfulness and meditation and relaxation, but it really is your parasympathetic and your sympathetic nervous systems regulating your internal system so that your external system feels better. So the more that you can learn how to breathe, and the more that you can learn how to breathe in anticipation of things, the more your nervous system will feel calmer overall. And the more calm you will feel overall, because your nervous system is what controls the majority of the output of your emotional self. In addition, and most therapists will use this, CBT or cognitive behavioral therapy, identifying the anxiety, talking about what happens when we feel anxious, what causes it, and what happens as an after effect, and then doing something about that, creating a solution. That's a really common way to manage anxiety with a mental health professional. And lifestyle changes often help us alleviate the symptoms of anxiety as well. So this is things like incorporating, I heard a really good example the other day, exchanging your HIIT workouts for a day of yoga, or exchanging your HIIT workouts for a nice calming walk, or spending 15 minutes at the end of your day watching the ocean because the ocean calms you. So lifestyle changes don't have to be exorbitant. They can be small things that you impact your day just even for 5 or 10 minutes. We do use medication in ongoing relief for the symptoms of anxiety. A lot of times we can avoid it if it's not something that you're interested in doing, but working with a psychiatrist or even your regular kind of PCP, sometimes in the short term, a medication can help bring your nervous system down to what we would call a baseline, or sort of your even keeled, and then you can come off of the medication eventually. And the fancy term is selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, and we use SSRI because it's really difficult to say selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors over and over and over again. Those are the most frequently prescribed medications for anxiety disorders, and what they do is they help regulate our nervous system so that our nervous system can operate from a calmer baseline. Any thoughts on that? I'm not a doctor, so I can't answer your specific medication questions, but I can answer your questions about how we use medication in conjunction with behavioral therapy, if you have one.
I have a question. I mean, I don't know if this falls under the purview of ask your doctor question, but are there things that people, not prescription wise, but are there things that people that they take in their diet, eating the wrong foods or whatever it is, that can kind of further push one into the depression or anxiety realm if they're already kind of wading in that pool of depression / anxiety already?
Yeah, I mean, I think realistically, all of us have dealt with those days where we have an emotion that we experience and we immediately go to like a comfort food. That's where the term comfort food came from. We go to things that help us feel better temporarily. There are absolutely holistic approaches to dealing with anxiety. And a lot of my clients choose that route because they don't love the idea of pharmaceutical interventions. But this is things like, instead of defaulting to something that you know is categorically unhealthy for you, it's that stopping, taking a breath, recognizing how you're feeling, and then making a different choice. Because sometimes it really is as simple as, instead of going to get this food, which I know is going to bring me short-term comfort, but it's going to make me feel like crap in the end, I'm going to take the extra effort. I'm going to prepare my food. I'm going to eat something that tastes really good to me, but also fuels me in a different way. And then that can help alleviate some of the symptoms that you're experiencing, because not only did you manage some of your anxiety, depression symptoms, but you made a choice that you also feel proud of. So instead of defaulting to an unhealthy coping mechanism, you consciously chose to make a different choice. And that often leads to us feeling improved. It's a good question.
Well, like, aside from comfort food, like for instance, if someone is prone to anxiety, if having too much coffee or too much Monsters or energy drinks or what have you, can that, but I'm not speaking from, I'm just asking because I was curious. I'm speaking for myself, but I think that's an interesting thing. Can that push them in the realm of
Oh yeah.
anxiety?
I mean, 100%. There's been so many studies about the effects of, I mean, where it's unfortunate for me to pick on Monster, but I'm going to, or Red Bull. But what they do is they incite your nervous system, right? Like they give you a jolt. Same with coffee. I mean, those of us that drink more than 1 cup a day, we recognize that little that it gives us, right? Like, oh, now I can get through my afternoon. Oh, now I can get through whatever it is. So the short answer is yes. The components of energy drinks and coffee and caffeine and even guarana and all those other things that are from plants, they still have an impact on our nervous and regulatory systems. So we use them to wake up or to get focused, but the effects that they have on our body are much more long-lived than we really recognize. So again, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a nutritionist. Have I drank Red Bull in my life? Yes, I'm a big fan of the yellow one. I think it tastes delicious. It gives you a little bite in the back of your jaw, the first sip that you take, and that little jolt is just so exciting. But where you need to recognize it becoming a problem is when A, you're over consuming them, or B, you're using them as a tool instead of identifying the problem and recognizing that there's potentially a different tool. And then recognizing that, oh, the reason my heart is beating 180 beats per minute is because I drank 3 Monsters before I went to work, and now I'm tripping out. So, good question. I feel bad for anyone who relies on Monster that doesn't like coffee, but all the best to you. Monsters. That's funny. Okay, so now could I have anxiety? Well, I mean, maybe you could potentially be dealing with a short-term bout of it. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disease and Disorders really does categorize generalized anxiety as excessive anxiety and worry. So if you look at the last 6 months of your life, or even if you're looking at the last month of your life for like a little capturing of data, if you have been anxious, worried, fearful, or avoidant for more days than you haven't been in the last month, it's probably worth taking a look at. Even if the diagnosis doesn't totally apply to you, if you've had difficulty controlling those feelings or working through those feelings, or you've had these really elongated stressors, or again, you're not able to sleep, Like, we need to look at that, because the long-term effects of not being able to sleep and dealing with worry aren't just the thing that you're worried about. It's also for those of you that were on the Maslow's hierarchy of needs training that we did, like if your sleep is disrupted, all the other things that your sleep impact are also going to be disrupted. So not only are you going to not get enough sleep, but during the day you're going to feel restless, but you're also going to feel tired. So you're going to feel amped up, but you're going to be like, why am I so tired? You have difficulty concentrating on things. You're going to probably feel really irritable. And then what you do is you grab a monster to help wake you up. And then that monster ignites your regulatory system, which is already irritable. And then you're just a big old conflux of stuff. And so if we can manage the feelings of anxiety and worry and handle some of the physical symptoms or some of the stressors that are causing the anxiety, then we can take a look at how that in the long term or over time will impact your overall feelings of wellness. And then, kind of recognizing that it isn't going to happen overnight. It is something that you're going to have to do every day, most days, to be able to combat some of these symptoms. And then lastly, we generally don't diagnose generalized anxiety disorder if there is significant substance use happening. This is everything from marijuana all the way up to like your fentanyls and methamphetamines. So if somebody's using one of those substances, and yes, it does exclude caffeine. Caffeine is not something that we're considering as a subset at this point, but it is something that any good therapist or psychiatrist will tell you to knock off while you're managing anxiety. But these symptoms are not due to some sort of substance use. I feel like I'm hating on Monster. I don't mean to. So how do we manage our symptoms? We've talked a lot about all the kind of negative stuff and the yuck stuff. So let's talk a little bit about the good stuff that we get, right? So when you have feelings of restlessness, irritability, or trouble sleeping, the very first thing that I want you to do is look at your sleep. If you are not getting the right amount of sleep for you, and that could be 6 hours, that could be 8 hours, that could be 10 hours. If you are on your phone for 2 hours in your bed before you fall asleep, if you are watching TV and you have to watch TV in order to fall asleep, all of those things are going to contribute to these feelings of restlessness, because by the time you finally fall asleep, your brain is still going and still active, and it's going to disrupt those first couple hours of your sleep. So I think that before I go on, actually, so Dean, the answer to your question is both yes and no. It says, could marijuana be a medication for anxiety? First of all, we don't categorize marijuana yet as a medication. I imagine in the future at some point it probably will be, especially with the evolution of how we're using marijuana. Right now you have to take into account the legality of it and whether or not you get your card and are using it in a manner with which parallels what you're supposed to be doing according to your treatment plan with your doctor. But yes, there have been lots of studies that have shown its effectiveness on marijuana's effectiveness on both anxiety and depression. So for those of you that don't know, there are a lot of dispensaries popping up all over Hawaii in which medical doctors are taking a look at symptoms that folks have felt and potentially prescribing some sort of THC to combat those. But you do need to work with a doctor. Full transparency, I don't really have an opinion one way or the other. I don't see why making it totally illegal is effective, but I also don't see why making it a free-for-all is totally effective. So I probably fall somewhere in the middle of that. But there have been people who have had really good results from things like marijuana, mushrooms, even ketamine for persistent PTSD and depression. So I'm always willing to look at the research around that.
So,
but if you don't have, oh yeah, go ahead.
So you mentioned, getting off of these various substances. Is that mainly kind of like to have like a baseline to then determine how you're feeling or something in terms of, I think you mentioned coffee and marijuana and stuff like that?
Can you rephrase your question?
I think you had mentioned stopping all of these substances And is that so that you can kind of get a baseline of where you at? You mentioned Monster and caffeine. Yeah.
So two approaches to this. One, if you're using illicit substances, like let's say you're using methamphetamine, you need to have some sobriety under your belt before we can really understand what the underlying condition is, whether you have a depressive disorder, anxiety, something like that. In the more typical world, when you're talking about things like excessive caffeine, or even like, there's gummies that are out now, there's vitamins that are full of, all that kind of stuff. You do want to either lessen or come off of some of those things. I would not, if you're drinking 6 Monsters a day, please don't come off of all 6 of them immediately. Bad things will happen to your body and you will not feel good. But yeah, I mean, you're right. To establish a baseline of what you're actually dealing with, which is why if there's substance use, we don't do a generalized anxiety disorder or a depressive disorder. You do have to come to a point where you understand, like, where do I live when I'm at my baseline, and where do I live when I'm at, how I feel with using other things. So to answer your question, yes, coming off of those things would help us get a better idea of what's actually happening, so that then we can treat the symptoms that are authentic as opposed to the symptoms that are created or caused by the thing that you're using.
Okay. Thank you.
Or that are making it worse.
Yeah. Not that I'm taking any of these illicit drugs. I just throwing out there for sake of discussion. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. I've worked in the substance use realm for a long time. And I think that's probably why I sit in the middle of the opinion about things like ketamine and mushrooms and things like that. I've had people tell me that they've had really amazing experiences with it, and I've had people tell me that they've had really horrible experiences with it. So the illicit stuff for me is easy, right? Like, you need to come off of it. You need to figure out what's going on underlying. But the other stuff, like, we don't know what works or doesn't work until we try something with or without it. And it's the same as exercise. It's the same as, meditation. Did you guys know that meditation is not effective for everybody? That there are types of disorders that meditation will actually make it worse? If you deal with persistent and excessive trauma, meditation is not going to be your answer. So, I feel like this is part of the reason why people come to a therapist, is because they have all this information floating around in their brain, and the therapist's job is to like help them say, like, okay, here's what we're managing and dealing with. Like, let's start with this and let's try this for a little bit. And it can really help you feel a lot calmer and safer when you're in a relationship with somebody that just gives you a place to come and be like, bleh, everywhere. So such a good question though. Thank you. Dean, right? Thank you, Dean. So again, none of these sort of what do I do about it are new. This isn't like I'm coming to you today with like these brand new ideas about how we create relaxation in our day-to-day, but these are all things that will help you if you're feeling restless, or if you're feeling irritable, if you're having trouble sleeping. Full disclosure, I almost always share something personal with you guys in these mindsets, but I have been mad for the last 3 days. I don't know why. I don't really have anything to be mad about. I did have something happen on Monday with a digital signature. I didn't understand why it wouldn't work. And so that kind of set me off. But the thing is, like, I wasn't using any of these skills to deal with my madness. I was mostly just complaining to my husband. And then at some point he said to me, hey, babe, it's not raining. Like, why don't you go for a walk? He's like, why don't you leave your phone at home and just like go for a walk and go enjoy yourself? And so I did. And of course he was right. And I felt a lot better. But sometimes these feelings are persistent because we aren't doing anything about them. And what I realized in my madness is, even though there wasn't really a big thing that made me mad, I didn't go to the gym Friday or Monday. I didn't take my walk over the weekend. I hadn't gotten in the water in a while. And those are all things that help me feel more at my baseline. So I'm no longer mad. I went to the gym. I took a walk. Everything's looking rosy again. But we really do have to put these things into our life and be committed to them and make that choice to do them in order to see what their effectiveness is. We can't just look at this and go, oh yeah, lifestyle changes. It makes total sense. We have to actually do them. And then we have to do a little kind of like data analysis. So Sunday and Monday, I was super mad. Today, I'm a lot less mad. So did those things that I chose to do Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday work? Yes, unfortunately they did. And again, we're just proving our own theory that when you take the time to do some of these things, like use deep breathing or journal or adhere to some sort of activity that you do every day, a lot of times these symptoms will alleviate. So we talked a little bit about breathing in the beginning. There's a couple of different ways that you can do breathing, and there's tons of YouTube videos and all kinds of things that you can access online. There's square breathing, which is 4-7-8 or 4-4-4. These are things like inhaling for 4, holding for 4. That's so funny. You're laughing at my breathing.
No, a text message came through. I'm so sorry.
No. Chad's laughing too.
Sorry.
I definitely wouldn't pick on anyone besides Chad. But I love a good funny text message because sometimes it'll snap you out of whatever it is that you're focused on. So, but the physical symptoms that you have that impact your day to day are like relatively simple, right? So doing square breathing takes about 2 minutes. You can literally do it while you're sitting in a class, while you're in your car, while you're waiting at Starbucks. And it will be effective for re-regulating your nervous system at the time. It may not cure the overall thing, but it will help you feel better in the moment that you're in. The second is what we call the 3-3-3 rule, or the 5 senses rule, which is, what's 3 things I can see, what's 3 things I can hear, and what's 3 things that I can move. Like I can move my fingers, I can tap my feet, I can run my elbow back and forth. These are all things that interrupt the anxiety symptoms that you're experiencing within your body and help you focus on something else. The fancy term for these are grounding techniques. What you can do that's the most effective that you can do almost anywhere. I would not suggest doing this in your car while driving, but what you can do is take your shoes off and put all the corners of your feet on the ground and recognize that each toe is touching the ground, that your heel is in contact with the ground, and that you can feel the ground underneath you and it's creating stability. And what that will do is it will remind your nervous system that gravity will pull you to the ground and that you can put your feet in a place that helps regulate and help you feel stable. One of the sometimes effective and sometimes not effective things that will help is talking to someone. The trouble is when you have anxiety and you call somebody to talk about your anxiety, there's a 50-50 chance that the other person is also dealing with something. So they may actually match your anxiety instead of helping you relax from it. So sometimes that's kind of a crapshoot, but talking to someone will help you get the information out of your brain and allow somebody to share it with you. Fourth, we can engage in thought-changing practices. This is things like, I'm feeling anxious right now, so you're going to give yourself credit. And then you're going to flip the thought into, I'm experiencing some anxiety, and anxiety is a feeling, and it is something that I can control and manage. And then you go to the third step of, I'm going to manage it by taking 3 really deep breaths, or I'm going to manage it by drinking a glass of water, something that's very simple and kind of in the moment that you can do. And then you're going to, which is the step we often forget, you're going to pat yourself on the back for doing something that changed the anxiety that you were feeling. So any other things that people have done in response to their anxiety that I can add to this list, or any other thoughts on things that are effective? I always love when people tell me what their coping mechanisms are.
Working out for me, but I don't know if that's the same for other people because it's kind of active. I don't know if it's, and the things that you're mentioning are more calming, but it helps me get it under control. I don't know why. I think maybe it's because it's the gyms get kind of my little safe space. And while it's chaotic, it's my own chaos. It's not the chaos of the world that's causing my anxiety. So I kind of feel a little bit safer in that little gym bubble. Yeah.
The gym's a really good one for folks who have chaotic environments outside of the gym, because at the gym, you generally know what to expect, right? Like, you know that there's going to be other people there, you know that there's going to be music playing, you know that there's going to be people working out. Depending on the gym you go to, you know there's going to be people slamming weights or dropping barbells, things like that. And so it's almost as if that baseline creates a piece of safety for you, so that when you walk in, immediately your nervous system is more regulated. Kimberly, like, the yoga thing is huge for me. I struggle a lot because I don't really enjoy yoga. Like I want to so badly because it's such an effective tool, but so many people in my life that do it and then engage in the process really enjoy it. So I tend to default to things like stretching, which is probably essentially the same thing, although yoga has a big mindset component to it. I'm a big fan of going for a walk. Listen, not all walks have to be like power walks. Sometimes it can just be a walk to get yourself out of your own head. Oksana, driving used to be a big one for me, but now ever since I moved to Hawaii, I get a little bit of road rage. So driving isn't always calm for me, because in Arizona and in Chicago, you could get on the freeway and just like, it was almost always open and you could just drive. Here, I find that that is not always the case. So I've done things like going to the beach to watch the waves or the sunset, or focusing on something else for a little while. I love going for walks because we live near Kapiolani Park. So it's very easy for me to just like hop out and go for a 15-minute walk. Raylan, I love that your answer also begs itself to another grounding technique, right? Like having, like touching someone else. I mean, there's a whole movement on Instagram and TikTok around strangers being blindfolded in public, asking for hugs and seeing, like in social experiments, how people react to that. So I suppose asking strangers isn't totally controversial, but hugs are good because they do they do two things, right? They force you to stop for like a good solid 10 to 15 seconds, but it also grounds you because the other person's feet on the ground and your feet on the ground are creating that grounding technique. So, and yes, certain friends do give like phenomenal physical touch hugs. And when you find that person, go for it. Thank you guys. That was so fun. I'm gonna add the hug one because that was good. So what do I do if I just listen to this whole presentation and I think to myself, you know what, it might be a good idea with consent. Yes, with consent. Absolutely. It might be a good idea for me to talk to somebody. Like what should I do? Well, the first option that you have is to talk to your PCP. It kind of depends on the type of PCP that you have, or if you even have a primary care physician. But sometimes your PCP, because they're doing more mental health training, can give you some of those options and help you feel like they're giving you a push in the right direction. So they would suggest things like eating well, exercising, getting outside in the sunshine, because all of those things will impact your nervous system and the way it regulates. I'm a huge fan of therapy, obviously. I love this movement that we have towards therapy, not just being about when I get to the worst of the worst, but sometimes doing things proactively to understand ourselves better. And if the worst case scenario is that you go to a therapist and the therapist tells you you're totally healthy and you're handling everything really well, I suppose you're not missing or losing out on much. Again, for those of you that don't know, a psychologist is a doctorate level therapist that doesn't prescribe medication. A psychiatrist is a medical doctor with specialty in psychiatric training that does prescribe psychotropic medications. You can consider that if it's something that you feel like you've been dealing with in a prolonged way. And I think, you know, at the end of the day, the person that you're accountable to is you. So if you're experiencing these symptoms and you're feeling a certain way and you think that there's something going on, try something. Try taking a walk every day for 10 minutes. Try one less monster. Try one connection with a friend, and create that accountability with yourself so that you're accountable to the things that you're trying. And I think, you know, you don't always have to make huge changes in order to create change in your life. Sometimes the change is very simple. For me, it was actually doing the things that I agree to do for myself. That's just the way it goes with me. Sometimes I forget to do those things, but the more that you can be accountable to yourself and the more that you can create a relationship with yourself in which you prioritize your own care, the better off you'll likely feel. my contact information, if you want to send me ideas for the next monthly mindset, we are actually mapping out the year right now. We're a little bit behind, but we're mapping out the topics for the year. So if you have something that you don't want to say publicly or you aren't ready to say publicly that you'd like me to talk about, please email me and let me know. I would be happy to talk about it. What questions can I answer about anxiety? What thoughts do you have?
Question.
Please.
Hi, Heather. So you mentioned that, people that may have had trauma or PTSD, that meditation might not be a good thing. I've never, I guess I have different ways of doing it, but I think I agree. And what would you recommend instead?
I knew somebody would catch it, so I'm glad you did. Thank you. And I really enjoy your poster, by the way. I like the It's Cool to Be Kind poster or
Thank you.
thing that you have on your wall.
Mhm.
Trauma is a really tricky beast, and we all experience it differently. And I will tell you from experience in my practice, most of my clients have experienced trauma, but have not given themselves credit for having experienced it because they think it's not that bad or mine wasn't that bad. And so sometimes when we talk about trauma, people with PTSD or the symptoms of PTSD think that that's not what they're dealing with. They think it's something else. And so in the exploration of trauma with your therapist or with your mental health provider, you may actually decide, yes, I did experience trauma and I'm going to accept that. And then figuring out what coping skills have worked in the past for other symptoms, you want to put that in with your newfound realization. The reason that meditation doesn't work in extreme cases of PTSD, this is more likely with things like veterans that have seen combat, people who have experienced natural disasters, really horrific car accidents, things like that. Meditation, when done prematurely in treatment, can sometimes create the flashbacks or cause the flashbacks. So in lieu of trying that, often therapists will start with journaling, and the journaling will be done in session. So the therapist will ask prompting questions, and the person experiencing the symptoms of PTSD or this newfound discovery that they may be dealing with PTSD will journal at that time. And it can feel slow, but sometimes through that journaling, you'll understand the impact of the event that happened. And then later on, you can move to things like grounding techniques or deep breathing. Another option is to do physically regulatory implementations. So things like putting your feet on the ground, guided meditation is an option too, right? So having somebody talk to you while you're in session to provide you with that safe space to be able to experience the quietness of your brain without the after effects of the trauma or the remembering or the flashbacks. You can have somebody talk you through, let's put both feet on the ground, let's put both hands in our lap. And as they walk you through that, you tend to feel safer, even while experiencing the trauma effects. And then thirdly, we don't have a ton of therapists that do this in Hawaii, but on Oahu, there's a special kind of therapy called EMDR. It's eye motion desensitization recovery. And essentially it's therapists who are specifically trained in this modality will guide you through the re-experience or the reframing of your trauma to be able to be desensitized to it. It's probably more than you were looking for from that question.
No, that was not, that was perfect. Thank you. That was helpful. Thank you, Heather.
Sure. I know somebody's going to email me and say, can you give me the name of an EMDR therapist? And I'm going to go, oh my God. Because I think there's only like half a dozen on Oahu. And again, because I sometimes share my personal desires with you guys, I really have thought about taking the training, but I'm afraid I'm going to be flooded with people who want to do EMDR, and it's a very heavy and intense therapy. I'm not sure I'm ready to experience that with my clients, So
Totally. You said it was EFDR?
EM, like Mary.
Oh,
DR.
okay. EMDR.
The EM stands for eye motion. So it's if for those of you that have seen it on TV, it's like usually a little piece of metal that has lights and your eyes follow the lights while your therapist guides you through a bunch of prompts.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's pretty cool actually. So who knows? I still got plenty of time in my career. Maybe I'll dive into it. You never know.
Thank you.
Not the same as EDM, although, Chad, EDM can be effective for other things. So I know there's some of you on this call that when you need to do like really hyper-focused work, you listen to EDM. Like mine's classical music, but my husband's is EDM because those beats in his head, they just like they help with his creativity so much. So I know that there's folks on that call that do that too. Other thoughts? Okay. Well, I really appreciate you guys having me and letting me talk about things that are super interesting to me. I get to go down the research rabbit hole for very good reasons, like sharing with you all. Again, you can email me or text me if you have something that you want me to talk about, or you need to talk to me about something, either way. And I'm just grateful to be able to come and share with you guys and thankful that you spent some time with me.
This topic of anxiety has given me anxiety. So I'll call you later to help talk me down on that.
Great.
No, I'm just kidding. These are always fantastic and we always learn a ton, and hopefully like these kind of things, you can take a little bit of it and apply it to, your life and what you're doing every day. And like Heather's message, if you need extra help, right, you can call her for help, or call for her to her for a referral or whatever it is. But this is kind of all about you and promoting self-care and mental health and all that kind of stuff. So as always, Heather, thank you so much for taking the time and pouring into us. We greatly appreciate it. And we will see you next month.
Okay. See you guys.
Bye, guys.
Bye.